Created with free version for non-commercial use.
In this lesson, we will learn about the CSS box model. Or in other words, we will learn that every element on a web page is essentially a rectangle or a box. And the CSS box model will let us understand that becoming a web designer really means learning how to manipulate and decorate boxes in any way that you can imagine. So let's get started. Here is an example page that I've created for this lesson, and we can see that it reads Box A. The HTML for this page is nothing more than a div with a class of Box A. So our goal for this lesson is to write bits of CSS code to begin to understand the way that boxes are formed, to begin to understand the box model. So the first thing we'll do is target that class. So period Box A. And the first task is to give it a background color. Background color, light gray. So this is something that we've seen in earlier lessons. There's nothing amazing about this. We've given the box a background color. The next property might begin to explain the box model, however. Padding 30 pixels. So we can see that the content of the box, this text of Box A in our HTML here, now sits 30 pixels from the top of the box where we can see the background color begins, and it sits 30 pixels from the left of where the content begins. Next, let's give our box a border. In our CSS, border, the first thing we do is decide how thick we want the border to be. So let's say we want it to be 3 pixels thick. We want it to be a solid straight line, and we want it to be black. So if we refresh, we can see that the box now has a border. Now, in order to continue learning about boxes, I think it would be helpful if we had more than one box on the page. So in our HTML, let's create a second div and give it a class of Box B. And we'll include the text Box B within the div. So if we refresh, we can see that it has not received any styling yet. So let's give it a bit of styling. Box B, background color orange. So if we save and refresh, we can see that that's in place. Now let's imagine that we want to create space between these two boxes. So currently we can see that they're pressed up against each other without any sort of space or margin. So that word that I just used, margin, is how we create space between these two boxes. So let's target Box A within this rule, and we'll say margin bottom 20 pixels. So if we save and refresh, we can see that Box A is now pushing down so that there's 20 pixels of margin or space between it and the next box. Now that we've seen padding, border, and margin in action, you understand the basics or the fundamentals of the box model. So a box is nothing more than an area that takes up space on the web page. To create space within the inside of that box, we use padding. To draw an outline around the outer edge of that box, we use border. And then to push or create space around the outside of the box, we use margin. Now that you're familiar with the basics of the box model, let's take things a step further and learn how to control the width and height of boxes. So in our CSS, let's imagine that we want the box A, the gray box, to have a width of 200 pixels and a height of 150 pixels. So if I save and refresh, we can see that we have fine-grained control over the dimensions, the width and height of the box. So if we wanted this box to be a little bit wider, we could increase its width from 200 to 250 pixels. And if we refresh, we see that it grows a little bit in width. Now the width and height properties become especially interesting when we begin to understand how they pair and relate to the padding, margin, and border properties. So for example, let's add identical width and height values to our second box, Box B. So if I save and refresh, we can see that even though we gave it identical width and height values, it's not the same size and shape as Box A. This is because we added padding and border to Box A, but you will notice that we did not add those properties to Box B. And padding and border are calculated when the browser determines the final dimensions of an element. So this box A is not actually only 250 pixels wide. It's also adding 30 pixels of padding on the left side, 30 pixels of padding on the right side, and then it's adding 3 pixels of border on each side. So let's give ourselves a goal. Let's imagine that we want to adjust box B's width value so that in the browser it appears to have an identical width as box A. So in order to do that, we'll need to do a bit of arithmetic. So 250 plus 30 pixels of padding on the left brings us up to 280, plus 30 pixels of padding on the right brings us up to 310, plus 3 pixels of border on the left brings us up to 313, and then another 3 pixels of border on the right brings us up to 316. So now, if we save and refresh, we can see that the boxes are identical in width. However, front-end web developers have more important things to do than crunching numbers just to determine the size of a box. So while it's important that you're aware of the way that padding and border affect the true size of an element, you have a luxury of being a web developer in the modern era. Now, in the last several years, there's a property that's arisen that will make our lives very easy. So that property is box sizing border box. So if I save and refresh, watch what happens to box A. It shrinks, and now it quite literally is 250 pixels wide. So now, on our box B, we don't need to worry about the weird arithmetic of adding this plus padding plus border. We can put this back to 250 pixels wide. And because we used box sizing border box on the element that has padding and border, the web browser knows how to calculate the size of box A so that it actually is 250 pixels wide. Now, when I mentioned that box sizing border box is a luxury of the modern era, all that means is that if someone is coming to your website and they're using a very outdated web browser, a web browser that hasn't been updated since 2008 or very early 2009, this property will not work. And in that case, their web browser will resort to using padding and border when calculating the overall width value. However, this is not a lesson on cross-browser compatibility. This is a lesson on the CSS box model. Now, in later lessons in the course, we will discuss how to handle site visitors that are using disgustingly outdated web browsers. But this is neither the time nor the place for that discussion. For the time being, I want you to stay focused on the box model. So I want you to reflect on padding, border, margin, and the way that we can create and manipulate boxes. Because in our next lesson, we are going to learn how to create a basic page layout with CSS. In other words, we will learn how to create a web page that actually looks like a typical web page, with different columns sitting next to each other, side by side, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So I will see you in the next lesson.
Created with free version for non-commercial use.